these are people in places that are energized by this new kind of activist, more radical Wahhabist approach to outreach in the world.
I don't think the majority of those sent were these neo-Wahhabis we're talking about. I think they were basically, and still are for the most part, interested in spreading Wahhabism as the main form of Islam in the Muslim world. And there were some who used, for example, they set up a charity called Al Haramain, which was both economic development, social, kind of a foreign aid program, that also sent missionaries all through. They had offices in 23 countries, I think, around the world. Al Haramain was used as a cover by some activists who took advantage of the structures to go abroad. And so there were some activists among these missionaries. However, I would not say every missionary they sent abroad was a activist.
There is this issue of the intertwining again of this formal religious establishment, its outreach, and the kind of Wahhabi Islam it's preaching. Mm-hmm. And the sense that somehow Saudi Arabia tolerated or encouraged this leading up to the 9/11 attacks. So I think for outsiders, it's very difficult to disentangle the strands as to what is the sort of normative Wahhabi strain and what is the radical Wahhabi strain.
Yeah.
And seen from outside, it really looked as if the Saudis were encouraging the spread of their own version of Islam, which had been extremely radicalized over the course of time. I don't think the Saudis fully realized what they were getting into during this period.
I don't think they did either. I thought I think they thought up to after 9/11 that their eye was on the battle with the Iranians and the Shiite attempt by the Iranians to spread Shiism. Their eye was on making respectable Wahhabism among the various currents of Islam, and to try and establish Wahhabism, which they never called Wahhabism, they called Salafism, as the dominant religious school throughout the Muslim world. Those were their objectives. And the political objectives came through activists that infiltrated the system and started using it to carry out their own missions and rather than the establishment as a whole ever meaning that to happen.
So the 9/11 attacks occur. 15 of the 19 hijackers are Saudi.
Right.
Bin Laden, who is the mastermind of this, gives the green light and the funding for it, is himself a Saudi. And yet you describe the reaction of Saudi Arabia as either shocked or denial, that either they didn't understand how this could be coming from their society, or they denied that it had.
They did indeed. They went into denial for quite some time. And it was extraordinary because those of us in Washington at that time turned to the Saudi embassy to try to get confirmation that these people were Saudis, and they would refuse to admit that they were Saudis. And said there must have been other people who had stolen Saudi passports, and they kept trying to find ways to deny that they were Saudis. And as we got more and more evidence that indeed they were Saudis, they slowly said, well, maybe some are Saudis, but they really stayed in denial. And to the extent that in an interview I had with Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was the Saudi ambassador in Washington since 1983, an interview I had with him in late November. This is September, October, 3 months after 9/11. He was still denying that all of these 15 alleged Saudis, which by then everybody knew were Saudis, or were convinced were Saudis, he was still denying that they were Saudis. And he was in denial, and here's the Saudi ambassador in Washington taking this position. So it was very hard for them to come to terms that their own religion could produce people like this. And They were furious that bin Laden had deliberately chosen Saudis to be part of this group as a way of driving a wedge between Saudi Arabia and the United States, which the extremists and the militants had been trying to do for years.
And in that sense, bin Laden was successful.
He was terribly successful.
There was a wedge driven.
There was a wedge driven.
And so you refer to a number of reports or documents issued in Washington at the time, which look at whether it's Saudi Arabia is a strategic ally or a strategic threat to the United States, which is unprecedented in the relationship.
It just opened up this debate. Is Saudi Arabia a friend or a foe of the United States? Is it a strategic ally? Is it a problem, or is it a problem, or is it an ally? And there was, you can't imagine how many conferences that were being held in Washington after 9/11, trying to figure out what had happened to the relationship. What did Saudi Arabia mean to us? Why had the Saudis done this to us, as the popular image was? You know, what had we done to them? Americans were questioning and asking. And it was an incredible shock for us, but it was also an incredible shock for the ruling family of Saudi Arabia to realize what had happened. So they go through this long period of denial. And then Al-Qaeda and bin Laden decide that they're going to try and overthrow the Al Saud family in Saudi Arabia. So they start blowing up, starting in May 2003. They start blowing up compounds. Compounds are the gated communities in which foreigners live in much of Saudi Arabia. They call them compounds, but think of it as a gated community in which foreigners live. Although there are also sometimes other Arabs and even some Saudis in these compounds. They started in May 2003, started blowing up these compounds, trying to kill as many people as foreigners as they could. Of course, they also killed Saudis. Then they started attacking government buildings. Then there were fights in the streets of Riyadh, the capital, and Jeddah, and the biggest city on the western coast. Gunfights in the streets. Finally, there were even attacks on the American Consul General in Jeddah in 2004. So they could no longer deny that they had a problem with their own people.